Thank you for joining us today. My name is Robbyn Lewis. I am one of the state delegates representing the 46th District in Baltimore City here in Maryland. And you're joining us today for the Rails-to-Trails PeopleForBikes webinar. Thanks for being here. We're going to get started. I'll give you a quick welcome, and then we'll dive into our agenda. I'll be your moderator today. A couple of things you should know about me, why I was invited to moderate this talk about bikes and people and Rails to Trails. Just so happens I'm the only car-free legislator in the whole state of Maryland. And what that means is when it comes to getting around, and we can use the term mobility in this audience, I know that won't scare you guys away. When it comes to mobility, access, equity, I think it's really important that those of us making policy have an on-the-ground perspective of what it means for the average person to get from point A to point B in a way that doesn't depend on cars. So I have a real appreciation for the work of Rails-to-Trails Conservancy and PeopleForBikes, and I really welcome you guys for inviting me to moderate today. The webinar will focus on the 2021 federal agenda for active transportation, really focusing on what Rails-to-Trails and PeopleForBikes are focused on, and particularly in light of the recommendations of the agenda that they released last week. In addition to that discussion, we'll also explore the implications of last week's election. Can you believe it was only a week ago? But how did last week's election set up the stage for federal active transportation policy going forward? So we'll get started. I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists. First, we have Kevin Mills, who's the Vice President for Policy with the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. Thank you, Kevin. And we have Noah Banayan, the Federal Affairs Manager with PeopleForBikes. And if you'd like, I'll invite each of you to say a few words about yourself and your work. If we could start with you, Kevin.
Sure, yes. So Rails-to-Trails is a nonprofit organization that's working to advance a nationwide network of multi-use trails. One of our functions, and one that I'm responsible for at the organization, is to advocate for better transportation policies and greater public investment in active transportation infrastructure. So we're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't get involved in elections, but we do work with elected decision makers to advance our mission. And we really see that we're at a critical moment here. America's experiencing a boom in trail use since the pandemic. We've seen it up over 60% since 2019, and we want to capture this moment and increase awareness and increased awareness and use of trails, and accommodate what's really been a long-term trend, but that's accelerated during the pandemic, to walking and biking as transportation and recreation.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Noah?
Sure, thank you, Delegate Lewis. Thanks everyone for joining. Excited to be here with Rails-to-Trails Conservancy in this culmination of our partnership. We've been, really excited to work together on these active transportation issues. PeopleForBikes coming at it from the bike industry side. PeopleForBikes is a national trade association for the bicycle industry. We represent about 280 supplier brands, a network of over 7,000 retailers across the country, as well as 1.4 individual grassroots supporters through our foundation. So we work for the benefit of the industry and bike riders and active transportation everywhere, along with Kevin and our friends at Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. Like he mentioned, there's a boom in trail use and there's a boom in bike sales too, and it's no surprise they're happening at the same time. So there's so much momentum that we want to keep alive through the winter and into 2021 to make sure that everyone has access to great places to ride.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for all you do. let's go ahead and dive into our discussion. We'll start with a few questions. Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot. Tell us, what does the new federal agenda for active transportation mean to your organization, to Rails-to-Trails?
Yeah, well, it definitely is, it's been a great opportunity to work closely with our partners at PeopleForBikes, really seize this critical moment where we see this boom and where we see different stars aligning in terms of the legislation that we think will be, debated in the coming year. And there's also a new administration going to be coming in with some new energy to find ways to do things better, as is always the case when you have a new administration. And so, so we just see this as a critical opportunity as well as a critical moment where we can, build on this momentum. Congress is going to have infrastructure at the top of their priority list with the federal reauthorization bill due, and there's pressure for economic stimulus and and efforts, pressure to deal with climate change and what have you. So it'd just be a very rich opportunity set for us. And so we wanted to put this out, into that environment to help advance our missions.
Right, and kind of set the tone of the conversation and the priorities. So thank you. Tell me, Noah, how, or rather, why did you develop this agenda at this time? What's special about this moment?
Thanks, Delegate Lewis. Like Kevin and I have said, there's just an opportunity. If there's any way that we can describe right now, with so many people coming to bikes and coming to active transportation in a new way for the first time in a while, they're dusting off what they've got in their garage and buying new carts. That translates into policy. That's grassroots activism through your feet, through your pedals, and we're wanting to take that momentum and that energy together through this partnership, through the shared membership we have with the industry and with advocacy organizations and individual supporters, and turn that into a shift in policy at this moment.
Great. Seize the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you both. Let's talk a little bit about politics and the political outlook. I know you're eager to jump right in. We're all primed over the last week. We've had a really exciting, nonstop introduction to political excitement here this week in the aftermath of the US presidential election. So we're going to spend some time talking about the federal picture, but I'm a state elected official, and I'm very much grounded in everyday life and the needs of my constituents in Baltimore City. I'd like to hear whether or not your organizations pay attention to local races, to state races, and what state level policies might be. How about you, Kevin?
Sure. So Rails-to-Trails does work on state and local policy. We were watching those races in the election as well, and very few states saw a shift in party control. New Hampshire legislature shifted to the Republicans, the Montana governorship shifted to the Republicans, but for the most part, we basically have status quo in the state legislatures and governor seats. So we think the biggest factor in our state and local work going forward is going to be scarce revenue due to COVID-19. States can't deficit spend the way that the federal government does, so they're struggling and looking for the federal government to help them out.
Right. What about ballot measures? I heard some hopeful news about ballot measures in a couple of places. I think Austin was one. What can you tell us, Noah, about that?
Absolutely. So PeopleForBikes has we call Vote for Bikes, and so we supported 48 ballot measures across the country this past election. 43 of them were approved, and this is in 17 states. And you're right, this has been an incredible election for ballot measures that support active transportation infrastructure. I think the total that we counted in these 48 measures was about $1 billion annually was secured through their approval across the country. And Austin is a shining example of what can change through ballot support. There were two, Prop A and Prop B, Prop A being the big shiny one That's about $7.1 billion over 15 years to support connectivity infrastructure in the city of Austin, which is, I think, record-breaking. I can't say that definitively, but I think so. And that wasn't the only one. They had another $460 million over 6 years through Prop B for public transportation networks. But it's not just Austin. You know, there were, like I said, 17 states that passed positive active transportation, bike-focused legislation, new taxes, things like that. A really great example to highlight too is in the state of Montana. You know, we saw a lot of news, I think, coming out of ballots specific to marijuana and drug use and decriminalizing different taxes, things like that. So in the state of Montana, they passed a 20% tax on marijuana that will go towards recreation, conservation, trail maintenance, public lands, things like that. So that's about, I think, 88.6 million over 5 years in the state of Montana.
And I'm just curious because as a state lawmaker, I'm always thinking about, and our legislative session begins in about 66 days. So I'm always thinking about approaches we could take at the state level. In Montana, you say they imposed a tax on recreational marijuana. That means they'd already decriminalized it, so now they can regulate it. That sounds like a really great idea that I think a lot of people in Maryland would be interested in. So stay tuned. Thank you both so much for that. Now that we've talked a little bit about the state picture, tell me about what we're looking at the federal level. Start with the U.S. House of Representatives. Everyone pays attention to the presidency. It really tends to suck up all the oxygen, but really the actions in Congress. I wonder if, Noah, you could start us off by helping us understand what happened in this last election at the federal level. What can we anticipate in the Congress?
Sure. So starting with the House of Representatives, you know, the Democrats' majority wasn't in question. It was pretty much a sure thing. They would keep the majority, but the margin that they've kept is actually currently estimated to be lower than what it was after the 2018 midterm. So Democrats still have the majority in the House. They did lose a few seats. I think they weren't expecting to lose, but we can count on that. There's still a lot of outcomes we might not know across Congress, but as far as House majority goes, seems pretty solid. And a really important race to highlight too was chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, Peter DeFazio from Oregon, the Eugene area. He was in one of the toughest races, I think, of his near 30-year career in Congress. So this was kind of a nail biter for folks who are looking for some leadership in the transportation and infrastructure space, but he won that race, and so he'll hold on to his chairmanship and I think bring a lot of the bills that the House passed and his committee passed last year into the 117th Congress.
I sure hope so, because we need help. There are cities like Baltimore that has a population of about 600,000 that could really use some federal transportation investment. So we'll look forward to that. From your point of view, Kevin, are there any federal bills, moving through Congress that we should be aware of? Anything, the surface transportation? Whoops, we lost your.
Yes, I know. Sorry, it was muted because there was noise, but I'm back. So yes, the federal surface transportation bill is reauthorized periodically. It actually came due in September of this year, but was extended for another year to September of 2021. In that time, though, the House did pass its version of the bill. We really think that provides a strong baseline for a new surface transportation law in 2021, and we definitely see a lot of interest in moving that forward early in the year, not just waiting till the deadline. So that's something that Representative DeFazio has said, and it seems is echoed by the Biden team as well. So that's probably the headline, but we're also very cognizant that there's a whole lot of attention to Corona relief and economic stimulus, job creation, and what have you. perhaps decline it, although that might be difficult to move forward this year. And some other things that I know are on NOAA's radar screen in that regard.
Yeah, we'll be paying attention to that here for sure. Unlike a lot of cities, Baltimore managed to hold on to its bus service. We still have people depending on buses to get to work every day, whereas in some places I know service demand dropped, 80%. We didn't have that here, but every context is a little bit different. So let's talk about the U.S. Senate races. The Senate got lots of attention this year because Democrats have been talking about winning some seats, about flipping the Senate and getting control of that chamber in their favor. The Democrats needed to gain 3 Senate seats to really have enough votes to make a difference with the incoming vice president as a tiebreaker. But at this moment, it looks like we fell short, and but there's a runoff election. So the Democrats could still win. And when I say we, it's because I'm a Democrat, sorry, full disclosure. But there will be a runoff in Georgia on January 5th, if I'm not mistaken. The 2 Georgia Senate seats are still too close to call, so there'll be a runoff in early January. What do you guys think will happen? How about you, Kevin? Are you taking bets?
Yeah, well, what I'd say is those are clearly going to be very hard fought races with lots of outside money, given that there's national stakes here. The Senate, control hangs in the balance. But given that the Democrats would need to win both, and that they're both currently Republican seats, and that there was a substantial margin by which the Republican candidates as opposed to the Democratic candidates in the Purdue race, the incumbent Senator Purdue's race, who, there was a pretty big margin in favor of the Republicans in that particular race. I think from our standpoint as an organization, planning for the coming term and thinking about what the political dynamics would be, that it'd be most prudent for us to anticipate that the Republicans will retain control. We'll have Senator McConnell as the majority leader. Obviously, lots of people will, debate that and put effort into that. But we're just looking to, plan for the coming term as best we can, given what seems the most likely outcome. So that's what we're thinking. Given that observation, we need to be concentrating on building bipartisan support for our proposals in the Senate. We have been engaging with the Commerce Committee, for instance, in recent months, because they have not yet done their piece of the reauthorization. And so we're engaging with both parties in that committee because they've got responsible for pedestrian and bicycle safety issues, and those are very important. Right? So that's one example. We're also looking at the Environment and Public Works Committee. That's one where the Republicans term limit themselves for chairmanships. And so there's going to be a turnover in control for the Republicans from Senator Barrasso of Wyoming to Senator Capito of West Virginia. And if the Republicans do control the chamber, Senator Capito will be the chairperson. And so with that new leadership and the passage of time, because the Environment and Public Works Committee developed their bill way back in the summer of 2019, we definitely see an opportunity for that committee to revisit the bill that they passed. And in this new context where active transportation is booming, we're going to make a strong case that they need to do more for our movement.
Good. That's the best approach, I think. Yeah. Thank you for that. How about you, Noah? What are you concerned about when it comes to the Senate?
I think just, we put these policies together without knowing what the outcome of the election would be. And I think, we know these are strong policies. We might have to compromise in some areas, but we put this vision and these goals together before we knew the outcome, because this is what we need to advance our causes and support active transportation infrastructure across America. of course, we work in DC, so we have to be cognizant of the political realities that we face. And I think the biggest question that might not be determined by who's in leadership in the Senate, but just on the ability of deal making within parties and across parties, is probably our favorite question in DC, is how do we pay for this? And that's going to be the big question when it comes to infrastructure. That was not decided in previous versions in this current Congress when we passed HR 2 out of the House, or with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee's version of a reauthorization bill for transportation. So regardless of the outcome of the Senate election, we're still going to be asking that question. We're still going to be debating whether it's deficit spending, a potential gas tax, or vehicle miles traveled tax. And that's where I think we have to really put our heads in and think creatively for some solutions for financing these important policies and honestly, really big, bold numbers.
Right. I'll just say as an aside, maybe we should look at what they did in Montana. Sounds like they raised some money for transportation. So tell me more, Noah, what are the big pieces of legislation that we should expect to see in 2021 coming out of the US Congress?
Sure. So again, even regardless of who is the Senate Majority Leader or the House Speaker, there's sort of a season of policy that will always happen in DC. It's what it gets attached to those policy packages, those really big items. That kind of depends on who's in power. I think the first thing that we can expect in 2021 is what we call tax extenders. And this happens pretty much annually. And there's a lot of opportunity there for something like the Bicycle Commuter Act, and making sure that people returning to work by bike get a little cash in their pocket for it, reinstating the bicycle commuter benefit, and other issues relating to taxes. Stimulus is obviously going to be a huge priority of the Biden administration. And again, whoever is in power in the Senate and the House, coming together. Even if we get something before the end of this lame duck session, it's still going to be a big priority to make sure that small businesses have the support they need, state and local governments have some support as they face budget shortfalls. And we could see infrastructure tacked onto that too. It's not a given, but there's certainly an argument to be made, and we're making it, that infrastructure is part of recovery. And bikes definitely play a role there too. We're seeing how many people are looking to bikes for their own health, their own wellness. So why don't we put that to work for the country? And so within that too, we have a transportation reauthorization, like Kevin mentioned. They have until the end of September of next year, it's their current deadline, to reauthorize that funding, and hopefully with some bigger, better numbers like we saw in the House bill, or like what we've put together in our agenda, our shared policy.
Terrific. Thank you for that. How about you, Kevin? What else? What other laws?
So I think even in the lame duck session, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in raising issues about the economy and corona relief and what have you. My guess is that there'd be a lot of pressure to do something, but that infrastructure may be too big to be part of that lame duck conversation. But I do see some really interesting commentary in the press from both parties. I've seen Speaker Pelosi as well as Senator Lindsey Graham, who just won re-election in South Carolina and will be the incoming Budget Committee chairman if the Republicans control the chamber. And they both agree there's room for common ground on transportation infrastructure. So, whether that takes the form of the reauthorization happening early in the year, or an economic stimulus in which infrastructure is looked as a source for job creation, or both. I think that opportunity for that discussion is there because both parties we have divided government. It's harder to move things, but both parties recognize that the infrastructure is important to our economic future, and so they might have different priorities, different appetites for the amount of spending and some things like that, or the type of spending, but they agree on that fundamental, and that makes it an interesting issue at a time like this when we'll have divided government. But I think maybe an impatience on the part of the American people to see Congress come together and do something.
Right. I hope you're right about that. We'll see. I think we're all really hopeful that, divided or not, our federal government will be able to make some decisions and really effectively meet the needs of the American people. So I'll be watching you guys, watching them very closely. So let's talk a little bit about the White House. We're getting a new president. What does a Biden presidency mean for active transportation? What are your expectations, Kevin?
Yeah, so, well, clearly, President-elect Biden is very interested in infrastructure investment, but being interested alone's not enough. President Trump has favored infrastructure investment all along, but probably on the list of political priorities where he's been willing to expend a lot of political capital, it's really not fought its way to the top of his list. And so he's not put a lot into forging an agreement on a palatable way to pay for it all, as Noah raised as a critical issue here. So Biden's ambitions on infrastructure, it'll be a kind of a new day to see how much he puts into that. But early on, he's been setting a tone of a number of themes. If you look at his transition site, he's talking a lot about COVID, the economy, racial equity, climate, and infrastructure figures into almost all of those issues in a significant way. And so, it is interesting to see that thread run through it all, and to see his team, talk a lot about infrastructure and making very significant investments there. So there's talk of action as early as February, when they get going after the inauguration. And one thing that means for us is we'll need to move quickly in terms of, many of our policy ideas are really pushing the envelope on what Congress has considered to date, or what they've had the stomach to do to date. And so we need to move quickly to influence the way that these things are framed, and the way the members are thinking about these issues, because it could be very queued up very early, right? But we do definitely see, managing COVID is going to be kind of job number one for the incoming decision makers, and making progress on any of these issues is going to be challenging if we have divided government. So there's lots of ambition in terms of the number of issues on the table. The needs of the moment demand it, but I also think we're going to see movement in some and probably not in others, just because of the way debates go.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of how it goes. 2 steps forward and then 2.5 steps back in the US when it comes to transportation, but we're not going to give up. How about you, Noah? Tell me a little bit, what are you expecting from Biden presidency with regard to transportation?
I think one of the most exciting things, well, there's a lot to be excited about in any transition, but looking at cabinet positions, to me, I find it a bit exciting. Who are the heads of these agencies that we're going to be able to work with? What kind of staff are they going to hire? Plays a huge role in the, maybe not necessarily the legislation, but a lot of the implementation, the regulations, everything that comes out of the agency side. So we'll be closely tracking the Department of Transportation nomination, Department of Interior as well, World Trade Association, so Commerce as well. And there have been some interesting names. It does kind of become this fun shortlist name game of folks from Congress, advocacy leaders. Looking at the Department of Transportation, we know Joe Biden is a big Amtrak guy, so he might be looking at someone from rail or with experience in that industry. But he could also be looking at mayors as well, as something we've been hearing, just given how closely tied they are to transportation systems, unlikely from a major city. So
not South Bend. Okay, just checking.
Talk more and guess about where he'll end up. I think another interesting pool to look at too of potential nominees for cabinet and other positions are Democrats who lost their re-election campaigns this season. So looking at Doug Jones in Alabama, some of the House races, I think they're, I don't know, but it seems like they're interested. Whether the Biden transition team is remains to be seen.
Right.
Yeah. So I might jump in there just in terms of the name game. I'm not sure that our audience wants to go too deep into that, but I certainly have seen much chatter about the LA Mayor Eric Garcetti as a potential pick here, which fits the profile of what Noah was describing. There are going to be some really critical issues for the next secretary to tackle that maybe a big city mayor would be appropriate to: equity in transportation, the future of transit, and some other urban issues. But we're definitely, we always work with USDOT on our issues. There are a number of things where the leadership of the agency really comes into play in terms of priorities and discretion, like, how would they spend these discretionary dollars they have through what used to be called Tiger and now called the Build program. That's something that our movement's benefited a lot from in the past, and we care how those priorities are set. Pedestrian safety has been going the wrong way for over a decade, and it's really critical that the next DOT be right on top of that issue and reckon with the hard issues that are behind that, like the way that the built environment is designed and technology and things like that. And again, the equity issues. Transportation has been used for decades to divide us, and it really needs to be used to unite us.
I love that. I co-sign that spirit of connection and using transportation as a way to repair the harms of the past. If we do it right, we can rebuild a different society. So thank you both for diving into some of the policy and political ramifications of the recent election and what we can expect in the coming year or so. I'd like to move us to that part of our agenda where we get to look at pictures. We have a slide deck that describes the federal agenda of Rails-to-Trails and PeopleForBikes. And so this will take about 15 minutes. So I'd like to hand the mic over to Evan and Noah to walk us through the next part of today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take the first piece. Could we get the next slide? So we've developed this federal agenda for active transportation in 2021. It's addressing both legislative matters as well as executive branch decisions. And so one thing I'll say, I believe there'll be a slide showing some of the wonderful national organizations that got in on the ground floor with us on these proposals. And I will say, there's just a wonderful range of types of groups, as well as just some very groups that are very influential here in Washington. So for instance, we've got the National League of Cities, Transportation for America, the Natural Resources Defense Council. We've got companies like Trek and Tram and WTB. We've got America Walks, REI, the Smart Growth America, Locus, which is real estate investors that see smart growth as smart business. We've got disability rights groups, several public health groups, and so on and so forth. It's just too many to name them all, but we're just very thankful for all those partners stepping forward right from the get-go. And that's something we'll leave behind for you all too, and is in the chat, is the link to our website where you all can sign on to support this agenda as well. So in terms of our policy recommendations, the first one we lead with is connectivity, active transportation connectivity, to be specific. And we see this as the top piece of unfinished business during the reauthorization as we build on the progress that was made in HR 2. And the idea here is to establish a new federal competitive grant program that would provide concentrated funding to build out regional active transportation networks. So if we can get that slide back, that's about connectivity. We just moved backwards. But the picture on the left, when that slide was up, was something called the Circuit. This is the Philadelphia and Camden metropolitan area, and in that area, they have planned for about 800. I'm sorry, I'm about to lose my my power, and we lost you. Maybe Noah wants to say a word while I make sure that I don't actually lose power.
Sure. I can't say I can speak to Kevin's specific example about the circuit, but I can say about Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act is we're excited to in the 117th Congress, and there's a couple strategies of getting there. There's this individual bill that can be included in an infrastructure package and the reauthorization bill. We're asking for increased funding from what was offered in HR 2, and we're also looking at stimulus as an opportunity. So like I mentioned before, using infrastructure, putting people to work, creating trail systems that make it easier for Americans to get around safely with social distance, actively. That's something we think fits really well in a stimulus narrative and is important investment for all communities. So that's I think that's connectivity. I'll take us into the reauthorization here. So we want to include the connectivity grant program, another, landmark funding program for active transportation. The largest federal funding source for active transportation is Transportation Alternatives Program, TAP. We're going pretty bold here and asking to double the funding, current funding levels for TAP. This year it's at about, I think, 800 million. So that would put us just over what the House was offering for TAP this past summer. Another important one is the Recreational Trails program too. This is something that Rails-to-Trails, PeopleForBikes, the Coalition for Recreational Trails more broadly has been pushing to increase funding for RTP so we can support trail maintenance across the country, make sure people have safe, active recreational trail networks to use with that increased funding. And I think Kevin's right back just in time. If you want to add anything else to connectivity and reauthorization is where I left off. Well, I'll keep going then. And Kevin, as you were able to figure out your speakers, we'll hear you and let you jump in. So that's reauthorization. Just for logistics, I'll remind everyone that was supposed to expire at the end of September this year, but the Congress was able to pass an extension, so that'll be until September of next year. So that gives them a year to work together with whoever's really going to be in leadership in the Senate and make sure that a really robust reauthorization bill is offered before September 30th of 2021. I think we can move to the next one, which, let's see if Kevin's able to get in. Not yet. Okay. Well, the next one's the US DOT structure. So this slide will come up soon. Something that we're really excited about with the Department of Transportation, besides just the nominee, is potentially shaking up some of the structure, or at least adding an active transportation administration within the DOT, US DOT. So dedicating an office, dedicated funding, dedicated staff to active transportation, I think will give our movement just a whole lot more capacity at the federal level to come up with, to work with the other administrations that handle issues like safety, like data, and working with FHW, the Federal Highway Administration, working with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and sort of liaising between all these offices within DOT to make sure that active transportation is inserted at every level with every office, and it's not just that, the side piece at the end that they add on, like, oh, we'll give you a couple feet for a bike lane. I think with an office that's dedicated to this. All right, so that's the Active Transportation Administration within the US DOT structure. So our recommendations on safety for this policy agenda build off of the US DOT structure recommendation. So within that Active Transportation Administration office under the US DOT, we really want people at the federal government basically focused on ensuring that the mandates of complete streets are upheld in all new design projects and all repair projects. How are we making our streets whole for everyone that deserves a piece of it? And using design really as the way to enhance safety. So instead of putting the blame where it might not necessarily need to be on the vulnerable road user, how are we looking at design solutions to make sure that safety isn't even an issue? If you're in a separated protected bike lane or a multi-use path that's separate from the road itself, or you have a sidewalk that's that enhances safety, the chances of any contact and injuries and fatalities just decreases significantly. And so we're really focused on emphasizing the need for better design in new projects and in maintenance as well. Equitable planning is another really important section on our agenda here. And I think you'll notice there are some, if you look through the other policies, not just in equitable planning, we certainly make a point to include it. So we want it to have its own section, like the DOT structure, have its own section or own office, but it still is highlighted and included in every other facet of what we do, what we're asking for, and the work being done. So with equitable planning, we're specifically hearkening back to the US DOT's Ladders of Opportunities initiative, which sort of looks back in time into transportation projects to better understand how some of them may have intentionally and sometimes unintentionally cut off low-income, historically Black and Latino and immigrant communities from economic opportunities, disrupted major commercial areas with highways, and analyzing those historical issues that our nation has had in transportation planning so that we can better understand the future and plan for a future that's far more equitable, doesn't cut off critical infrastructure and commercial needs, makes the grocery store a lot closer than it might exist for some communities. And so that's something that we want to revive. We want DOT to revive that program, as well as think creatively about pilot programs we can use to make future transportation planning, active transportation, more equitable and accessible in communities and neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested.
I want to just jump back to the connectivity discussion a little bit, just a little bit of back story on that. Is that really see this as our top piece of unfinished business in the reauthorization. HR 2, the House bill, included this policy idea, but they only funded it for fiscal 24 at a level less than what we asked for. And so as we come back to the new Congress, we want to say we're at a new point in time where we're seeing greater demand. We're seeing communities all across the country are looking to build out regional networks in a way that can't be done in a reasonable period of time with existing tools. So that we need a policy tool that gives you the depth of funding to fill in all the strategic gaps in a network, as well as to make connections between communities and ultimately across state lines. And that's what this bill that we introduced would do. Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act will create these regional spines and these long distance spines and these regional networks in a way that'll really serve urban, suburban, and rural areas, and ultimately give us this national network of active transportation infrastructure that'll get people where they need to go and connect communities to each other. So we see this as a key innovation in federal transportation policy. We've seen some states take the lead on this, like California has an active transportation program that really takes this approach, and Caltrans, the DOT in California, is supporting this approach for that very reason, so that they need the federal government to play its role in addressing this, this great need that's grown up over the last couple of decades as those core programs Noah mentioned, transportation alternatives, recreational trails, have built a series of facilities all around the country. We still need to take the same approach we've always taken with roads and rails, which is to say, what do we need on the ground to make this work? What will make it functional? How do we connect people to places? And then go and do it and make the investment you need to put it all together. So that's a key take-home point for us.
Thank you. So it looks like we've lost access to our slides temporarily, but if we continue moving along our agenda, the next item was climate, and then after that, e-bikes.
Right. I'll wrap these up pretty quickly so we have time to get to questions, but I'm potentially most excited about these two as well. So climate, you'll know that if you look at this agenda, we've really tried to weave it into the narrative quite strongly and make a clear point that active transportation infrastructure is part of the solution to climate change. It is a messy problem. There is no one solution, but active transportation absolutely plays a role. And building infrastructure that helps people to walk, bike, use shared micromobility devices and other systems that don't emit carbon and are carbon zero will ultimately lead us to a place where we can lower our transportation emissions in the US. Transportation is the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I think the last estimate was 28% are from transportation, with a lion's share of that being from single individual car trips. So the more that we can make biking accessible, walking accessible, as a not an alternative mode of transportation, but the main mode of transportation or someone's first option, that's going to significantly reduce our national emissions and help us with our climate change goals as an industry, as a movement, and then at the federal level, we know it's going to be a really big priority for President-elect Biden. And so we're looking at ways that we can build active transportation infrastructure through grant programs focused on reducing carbon emissions through different forms of legislation. That's something we've seen introduced and upheld in HR 2, the infrastructure package, and a specific climate action report that the House put out this past summer. That weaves really well into e-bikes too, because if we're thinking about how bikes can in many ways replace someone's car as their first mode of transportation, their first choice, an electric bicycle is probably the best option. This shrinks the distances, it makes the hills a little bit less hilly, it gets you where you want to go a bit faster without as much sweat. I know living in DC, I'd have a hard time bike commuting if I'm wearing a full suit, but on an e-bike, I did not have this issue last summer when commuting was a thing. So, we're excited about using infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure to help solve climate change, to help reduce our national emissions. And we're excited about opportunities to incentivize e-bike purchase, e-bike riding, make e-bikes more accessible for more Americans. They're not as expensive as a car perhaps, but more expensive than a regular bike. And so there's a lot that we can do through policy to shrink that distance a bit.
Could you talk a little bit about what kinds of incentives might work to make e-bikes more accessible?
Sure, yeah. There's a couple different ideas in play, and then a lot more that we have just out in the ether right now. A really concrete example would be the Bicycle Commuter Act, which actually would include electric bicycles as eligible for a commuter benefit alongside regular bicycles and bike share as well. So that's about $54 a month in your pocket for commuting to work by bike, but can be used along with parking, transit benefits, etc. But even bigger than that, we're looking at purchase incentives or tax credits at the federal level to lower the cost of an e-bike to the consumer so that you have more purchasing power when you go to a bike shop and want to get an e-bike to help you get around. But there are really creative financing options happening somewhat across the US, but more so across Europe. that's been really exciting to watch new ones pop up. I feel like in a European city every week over the course of this, past 6 months. We're talking to utility companies. There are some really great examples of utility-based rebates. States have a bit more autonomy in how they want to handle their tax credits. So we've been in conversation with a few states, counties as well even. And then in the private sector, some major employers have taken the initiative on their own to incentivize bike commuting or e-bike purchases as part of a health and wellness program too. So I think the opportunities are literally endless when it comes to e-bike incentives. And I think if you've never ridden one, I really hope you get the opportunity to whoever's listening to this, because once you do, I think you'll get it. It's really hard to quit e-bike once you've started.
It's transformative. Thank you so much, Noah. Let's move on to questions. I think we have a question here for you. Where do e-scooters fit in the active transportation ecosystem?
I think they fit in a bike lane. I think we maybe can call them, micro-mobility lanes or something. That's kind of a mouthful. But I think, I worked for the PeopleForBikes as representative of the bicycle industry, but we work really closely with the North American Bike Share Association, which does include scooters as well and all shared micromobility. We don't want to prescribe necessarily how people choose to get around. If they're moving, they're out of a car, they're using, active transportation infrastructure. I don't know that a scooter is necessarily active, but they're still, they have a spot in the bike lane. We're absolutely supportive of that, and more people finding a way to move around without emitting carbon, without adding congestion. Seems like it's all good with us. We're excited about that too, and want to make sure we're inclusive of scooters as well.
Good, glad to hear that. Here's another question for you. What efforts are being made concerning maintenance and upgrading existing facilities? I think that must refer to bike facilities.
So what efforts are being made
regarding maintenance and upgrade of existing, and I'm assuming that means bike facilities.
Sure.
How do we make what we have?
So when we talk about all these programs like TAP or RTP or even connectivity grants, I don't think any part of that has to be specific. None of it's specific to new projects. A lot of it is repairing existing issues, making sure that existing trail networks are safe, accessible, connected. They're not overgrown or roots are coming up. And so that all comes through trail maintenance, which is funded through these programs that we're supporting. And a really, I think, important part of the House's Moving Forward Act was this repair first. And so instead of just building our problems away with new infrastructure that might not always be necessary, how can we look at what we have and try to fix it first? I think fix it first was actually the title.